The opinion of the Gurubsar of the Vishnu Society, about the Surinamese ketikoti. Slavery had not been abolished on the Dutch and Danish Caribbean islands after 1848, which caused great unrest among the slave population at the time. Subsequently, a slave revolt broke out on St. Eustatius, and on St. Martin, many slaves fled to the French part of the island where they were free. As a result, on June 6, 1848, in St. Martin, a proclamation declared that the slaves of the Dutch plantations will be treated as free individuals. This meant that on St. Martin the slaves were in fact already free in 1848. Abolition of the enslaved was only discussed in Suriname in 1863, and then they were not even free as is claimed, but the slaves could only get rid of their position of slave after 10 years of state supervision. So, slavery was not officially abolished in 1863 but in 1873. In the celebration of emancipation, everything is grouped under the Surinamese ketikoti, broken chains. And the population of the Leeward and Windward Islands must accept this. No wonder that a large part of the Antilles and surrounding islands feel disadvantaged and second class and do not participate in the Surinamese ketikoti event, and rightly so. When the Netherlands finally abolished slavery, the slave owners were paid generously for their property, the slaves, but the slaves themselves got nothing. Or at least, they got a good beating with the whip. The compensation paid by the Dutch government to the slave owner in Suriname was 300 guilders per slave as compensation for the lost property. Yes, you heard it right, a slave was the property of his master or mistress. In Curaçao, this was 200 guilders per slave. This was arranged through the compensation files. In the Dutch East Indies, the amount was 50 to 350 guilders, depending on the age of the slave. The slave owners claimed this compensation through lists of people they owned, the so-called statements. In total, the compensation amounted to almost 12 million guilders, about 10% of the government's expenditure in 1863. As a modern monk, Octenhove transcribed the slavery archives by hand in the National Archives. And whether it was done correctly, only Joost van Del knows. As an alternative to the use of slaves, contract workers in Suriname were recruited in distant countries by former slave owners, including in the Dutch East Indies, India, and China. These were the poor Javanese from Indonesia, the poor Chinese from China, and the poor Hindustani from India, who were called coolies by the whites at the time. At that time, the rule and divide system was already applied, so that the various population groups have the discrimination virus in their DNA to this day. One nation was favored and the other was not. In this way, the residents and poor overseas illiterate people were pitted against each other in a very devious way by the government that brought them in. That is why in Suriname and the Netherlands you still hear stereotypical slogans such as Negroes or Surinamese are lazy and stupid, and Surinamese have several wives, and then they only refer to the black Surinamese Negro population. But if you look back in history, you will notice that the white people were the biggest slackers. They did not want to get their hands dirty with the hard labor, so they first let the original inhabitants of Suriname work for them on the plantations with false pretenses, with or without force. When the natives turned out to be too weak for the hard labor, the Dutch started to buy Negroes from Africa from the black African rogue tribes to put them to work in Suriname and the Caribbean under appalling conditions. It is certain that the Bible was the example and the incitement to slavery. According to the Bible that the Surinamese worship so fanatically, people can be bought and sold. Owning and trading in fellow human beings is, according to the Bible, part of the normal course of events. It is therefore not surprising that proponents of slavery and apartheid have defended these atrocities with the Bible in hand. That most of the main characters that appear in the Bible, such as Abraham and Jacob, own slaves are evident from the fact that the 10th commandment specifically mentions slaves and is mentioned in the same breath as cattle. The first line of the 10 Commandments mentions that God has freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, but it does not lead to a general prohibition of slavery. On the contrary, it is clear from Commandments 4 and 10 that God sees owning slaves as an accepted part of society. See Genesis 17 verse 23. And Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought, and with his money, every male among the men of the house of Abraham, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins in the same day, as God had spoken with him. And the inhabitants of Canaan who survived the conquests and all his descendants are enslaved by King Solomon forever and ever. God himself also sells people, orders people to be enslaved, and or uses slavery as punishment. In Joel 3 verse 8 it is written, "And I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah, and they shall sell them to the Sheba, to a people afar off, for the Lord hath spoken it." In addition, slavery is not a problem as long as the slaves are taken from other peoples in foreign countries. See Leviticus 25 verse 44. 44, As for thy manservant or thy maidservant whom thou shalt have, they shall be of the nations that are round about thee, of them you shall buy a slave or a female slave. 45, And thou shalt buy them of the children of the foreigners that sojourn with thee, of them and their kindred that shall be with thee, whom they shall beget in thy land, and they shall be your possession. 46, And thou shalt make them possessors unto thy children after thee, that they may inherit the possession, thou shalt make them serve forever. But over your brethren the children of Israel, each one over his brother, you shall not rule over him with cruelty. So, the slaves and the descendants of the enslaved peoples are hereditary property and continue to serve the master's family for eternity. This is described in Exodus 21 verse 4, that when a slave has children by a female slave, those children are automatically the master's property. Furthermore, the beating of slaves is also allowed if there are no deaths. This can be read in Exodus 21 verses 20 to 21. Also, the slave, who chooses his family instead of his master, is nailed to the doorpost with his ear to make clear who his master is. The passages dealing with this can be found in Exodus 21 verse 6 and Deuteronomy 15 verse 17. In addition, God is the only one who determines which population group is condemned to slavery and which may be used by Christian slave traders and slave owners to justify the possession and trade of people. Also Jesus Christ, the invented caricature of Emperor Constantine and his allies and the writers of the New Testament, do not rebel against the injustice of slavery, but do their utmost to maintain the existing power relations, however unjust they may be. In all of this, we are presented with a worldview in which the master has absolute authority over his subjects and can act as he sees fit. See Matthew 25 verses 14 to 30. Also, slaves, in the name of God and doctrine, must obey their masters. See 1 Timothy 6 verse 1. Slaves must obey their masters for the greater glory of God. See Titus 2 verses 9 to 10. Slaves must obey their masters just as they obey Christ. See Ephesians 6 verse 5 and Colossians 3 verse 22. Slaves must obey your masters, in everything, according to the flesh. See Colossians 3 verse 22. Even when slaves are treated unjustly, a slave must acquiesce to the whims of his master. To this end, read 1 Peter 2 verses 18 to 19. The slaves who want to escape their miserable situation and therefore convert, thinking that they will then be free with the grace of God, immediately met their disappointment, because a converted slave was then brought back to his master without mercy. It is most vicious that the translators of the Bible try in all sorts of Christian ways to transform slavery into florid pseudo-pious words of wisdom to divert the attention of the slave drivers and of God's wickedness. They have done their utmost to disguise the dark biblical slavery past as much as possible by replacing the word slave with servant or handmaid, giving the impression that we are dealing here with labor relations between employers and employees. In the Old Testament, the word servant is written more than 600 times, but the word slave is only used 15 times, while the original text contains the same Hebrew word obd in all these cases. The word slave was only used if the writing could not be avoided and there was talk of sale or hereditary property or if it benefited the punchline of a story. The New Testament is written in Greek, but the word slave is not used anywhere in the King James Version, but the Greek doulos meaning slave is translated as servant. It is clear that the word is also used in places where a clear distinction is made between free people and servants. In short, the writers of the Bible as well as the translators of those scriptures were evil people who were committed to the oppression and backwardness of mankind, and this trend has been unquestioningly continued by the followers of the Bible in modern times. And having several wives is the responsibility of the Surinamese men. But who for over 300 years forced or not forced the African slave women, the properties of which physical intercourse was reserved only for the slave owners to have sex, to get more slaves? In the beginning, the black male community was forbidden to sleep with black women. This was not allowed until much, much later, and in the meantime the white slave drivers celebrated orgy parties until they dropped. That polygamy in Suriname, the Netherlands Antilles, and further in other parts of the world where the belief in God has settled openly or in secret takes place in the eyes of Allah or God. The Old Testament records that several prominent men practiced polygamy. The fictional figures in the Bible, including Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon, and others, all had multiple wives. In 2 Samuel 12 verse 8 God said through the prophet Nathan that if David had not had enough of his wives and concubines, he would have given David even more. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, the latter being actually wives, but of lower status according to 1 Kings 11 verse 3. But polygamy or bigamy is not explicitly condemned anywhere in the Bible. See Lamech in Genesis 4 verse 19, Lamech took 2 wives. So example follows. Various theologians and sympathizers of the Bible have tried in the course of history to justify the allowing of polygamy in the Bible by their fictional God with all kinds of twisted and insane theories that make no sense. Nevertheless, one cannot ignore the fact that God and Satan are the same characters. Over time, some of the white masters who liked to function as bulls in time of slavery regretted their misdeeds. To compensate for this, they gave the Creoles, their offspring, pieces of land, a better position in the labor market, and had a few undergo training as far as that was possible at the time. And as for the later Surinamese people regarding polygamy and the rule and divide policy, and so on, the people followed the example of their oppressors. These are just a few of the traumas that the Surinamese people have suffered from white domination. The fourth generation of Surinamese born from 1900 and the generations after have no right to celebration of the slavery past or apologies, because they have not suffered. Today they unjustly live like bloodsuckers on the backs of the non-religious ancestors who suffered and were slaughtered for centuries under the yoke of the former colonial rule. From the moment the Surinamese people switched to colonialism and adopted the religious teachings of the murderers of their ancestors, they no longer have anything to do with slavery and its past. In fact, the current Surinamese and others do not celebrate the abolition of slavery on July 1st. Rather, they celebrate the abolition of the cultural bond with their non-religious ancestors who suffered under Christianity in the name of the white God whom they now fervently worship. They have shamelessly broken the shackles of the past by entering the waters of the former colonialists instead of choosing the path of justice. They are fond of the rule and divide system of their former oppressors and are bound by the laws and regulations of the former land thieves. They feel elevated by the so-called democracy, which is organized distrust. Thus, those Surinamese have nothing to be proud of. In other words, the facts about slavery and the celebration of ketikoti are only a Creole event and have nothing to do with the abolition of slavery, but with condoning Christianization and stroking their own egos. Have you seen how those revelers always behave on July 1st? They are dressed like peacocks and walk around perky, and I sometimes wondered where they suddenly got that pride. While they sing all kinds of crooked songs at the top of their lungs and do their dances with great passion, most of them at the same time look accusingly at the white world, while they themselves are the most hypocritical creatures on earth. And the rest of the participants at home and abroad, as well as the current king and other dignitaries of the Netherlands, cry crocodile tears and make dumbfounded excuses to the Surinamese who do not deserve it. And those statements are made unsolicited in the name of the current Dutch people, which have nothing to do with the slavery past. Furthermore, the party droolers eagerly plunge into the idiotic festive bustle without thinking. Ketikoti is succinctly said the day of hypocrites. I can imagine that the ancestors who suffered, mistreated, and finally killed by the colonial system, who are currently honored and worshipped by the Surinamese today, logically through nature have pronounced the curse of the damned on those who do not deserve to be called offspring but must be expressed in one line with terms in which normlessness, mindlessness, headstrongness, and greed predominate. And that kunu, the natural punishment, is already well underway among the so-called slave descendants, which will continue for many generations until they are aware of the trauma they have suffered through all these centuries at the hands of their adopted God, law, and order. Collaboration, greed, selfishness, and hypocrisy are excused and intertwined with the Surinamese concept of ketikoti. Given the ceremony prior to their alleged feast, this is also done on behalf of the self-invented evil god of the white folks, their Masrad Gato, who does not exist. Sorry.